think I'm going to introduce myself so we can just get started. I'm Dr. Pete Gathje, and I teach at Memphis Theological Seminary. And I am not a biblical expert. I'm an ethicist. So I am going to try to approach things from the standpoint of ethics. But I would be interested in hearing from you first just exactly what you've been doing with this amazing amount of texts that you're asked to read every week, and ask what would be most helpful for you. I can go in a variety of directions, and there's a lot to talk about from the readings this week, so I'm interested in what would be most helpful for you. So who is the brave soul who might contribute an answer or a response? Yes, ma'am. And what did that tell you? Unlike the Bible itself. Yes, ma'am. Well, what stood out from what you read? Mm-hmm. Great. That's a pretty good summation, I think, of what the reading for this week is about, how to live well. I was actually sitting in the Great Hall, a number of you were probably here for worship, and there's somebody leading a class there. They're doing something with poetry, and since I was just sitting there, he didn't realize that I was a speaker over here, and I didn't either. I didn't know which room I was going to be in, so he asked me if I would read a poem. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to read a poem. And then I was brought over to this room, so I couldn't read the poem. I won't read the whole poem, but it's a great poem by Mary Oliver, and actually fits, I think, with the theme for today. This poem is called The Summer Day, and it ends with this great question. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Which is a great question. What will we plan to do with our one wild and precious life? And your rival Episcopalian church, that one over on Poplar, the one that shall not be named, they have a sign out front of their church that actually, and I just noticed that I was driving down Poplar, that has that exact quote on the sign. So my kind of field of expertise, like I said, is ethics, and so let me begin by focusing on the Sermon on the Mount. And in particular, there's some things on the Sermon on the Mount. I always bring a handout so that no matter what happens, you at least feel like you got something. There are things in the Sermon on the Mount that sound impossible, like don't be angry, don't ever lust. So what I would like to do is try to think through those, and I'm going to leave the camera for a minute, so I'm going to disappear, but I'm going to continue to talk. If you can hand those out. Thank you. I hope I kept a copy for myself. I did. In your reading of the story, did you come across anything in the Sermon on the Mount that seemed just impossible for us to live in this life? Everybody has one or getting close to it? Great, thank you so much. Shortly after the Beatitudes, which I'll come back to, thank you. in Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 21, and this will be the first of these triads. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So, when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So if we look at this little handout, this is from a book by Glenn Stassen and David Gathje, which is called Kingdom Ethics, which, if you're looking for a really good Christian ethics book, that's a good one. What they have argued is that in each of these teachings through the Sermon on the Mount, there's a pattern, and it's a triad pattern, that Jesus begins with traditional righteousness. You have heard that it was said. And then the next move is that he's describing a vicious cycle, or there's one that's assumed within that traditional righteousness. And then there's a transforming initiative. So what Jesus is actually giving us in the Sermon on the Mount is not a set of high ideals that we can never practice, but he's actually giving us very concrete practices by which we can live into this new reality that he's proclaiming called the kingdom of God. So if you look down some of these, the traditional righteousness, unfortunately, is sometimes what we either identify with, or sometimes we identify with the vicious cycle and we miss the transforming initiative. So I think it'd be good for us to, you can take this home for your homework, and take out your Matthew Sermon on the Mount and kind of work your way through these transforming initiatives, and you'll be able to see that this is actually a way that we can live, those wild and precious lives. So I think it's a helpful way to go, especially when we come across passages that have often been ignored within Christianity. So let me go to Matthew 25, starting at verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, and here we have a little translation problem, because the usual translation is, do not resist an evildoer. And a better translation would be, do not resist evil with evil. Or as Romans 12:21 puts it, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Because let me ask a question of you. How many of you think that it's really good not to resist evildoers? That we should just be passive in the face of evil? Seeing no hands go up, I'm assuming that no one thinks we should just be passive in the face of evil. If we're passive in the face of evil, what happens? Yeah, evil triumphs. And we certainly don't want that. And so if Jesus was teaching that, I don't think he'd be a very good teacher. And I know that's a dangerous thing to say in a church, but I think he was a good teacher. And he was actually saying something that we miss, which is, do not resist evil with evil. Or as Paul put it, do not resist evil with evil, but rather resist with good, in Romans 12:21. So, and then he gives us some examples of how we could resist evil with good. So the next things that follow. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. So I need a volunteer from the audience who will step up here and be on camera with me. Anybody want to get out of those pews? You were probably in, how many were in worship? So you should be tired of sitting in pews by now. So come on up. I always love the brave volunteer. No, you get to strike me, actually. Hi, I'm Pete.
Hi, Jim.
Good to meet you, Jim. So you might notice if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, so this is my right cheek. So I'm going to ask you to try to strike me on my right cheek, but you have to use your right hand.
Okay.
Okay? So what did he do? It didn't hurt, I promise. It might have sounded like it, but it really didn't, because we've practiced this, actually. What did he do? He had to turn his hand, and he had to kind of backhand me, right? So if I turn my other cheek, so this is going to be my left cheek, and he still has to use his right hand.
You got your thingy there.
Yeah. So he's going to have to backhand me, right? And so Jesus is talking to what kind of folks? The lower class folks, right? Who's going to get backhanded? Right, and low class folks. And so you get backhanded and you turn the other cheek, he's confronted with a choice. He could hit me face on, right, with a fist, but if he does that, what does that imply? Equality. Why can't he use his left hand? Because that would solve the problem. We're in church and everybody's trying to be polite. Why can't he use his left hand?
Unclean.
It's unclean, so you can go sit down again. What's that? And why? You clean, very polite, yes. That's why I like Episcopalians. They're very polite. So you clean yourself after you go to the bathroom, right? And so if you used your left hand, you would become unclean. So you don't want to do that. So see what Jesus is doing here is he's actually giving people a way to resist nonviolently, to resist the evil that's being done to them. It's dangerous, of course, right? So you could still get hit, but if you get hit in that way with the fist, that's going to imply equality, which the superior is not going to want to indicate. So Jesus is not telling people when evil is done to you, just roll over and let it be done. He's giving specific ways in which we can creatively resist the evil that's being done. It's still dangerous, but sometimes we forget that violence is dangerous too. Not everybody who uses violence in response to evil ends up not having violence done back to them. So Jesus is trying to give us a way that we can resist evil without imitating the evil that's being done to us. And I think that's pretty challenging, because one way we could think about this is that we relatively easily, we say that we believe in Jesus, but the more difficult task is actually to believe Jesus, to believe that what he's saying is something that we can actually live out. So with that in mind, let's go back to the Beatitudes. And we want to think about the Beatitudes as also practices, things that we can do day in and day out. So I'm going to start with, and we won't have time to go through all the Beatitudes, so I'm just going to start with the first one. And I'm starting with that because it's the first one. And I think it's a key. It's Jesus, I think, organized these in a way of importance. So in Matthew's gospel, it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Are there any biblical scholars in here who know what it says in Luke's gospel? Luke just has, "Blessed are the poor." That in spirit is not there. Why do you think the change? Matthew and Luke are relatively contemporary, so it's not that much difference in time. How many folks in here are poor? I'm not. I mean, I couldn't raise my hand. So one of the fascinating things about Matthew's gospel that we can kind of miss sometimes if we're reading like the story is that each of these gospels is very distinct, and they're written to distinct audiences. And you have all, how many folks here are lay people? Are there any ordained people sitting out there? So as lay people, how many sermons do you think you've listened to in your life? Several? So what do good preachers do when they preach? They adapt, or they try to talk about the Scripture in relationship to the audience that they're addressing, right? So Matthew, his community was wealthier than Luke's, apparently. Luke is saying, blessed are the poor. Matthew has, blessed are the poor in spirit, because Matthew, as a preacher, is trying to adapt something to a wealthier audience. At least that's one possibility. So then we have to figure out, still, what does that mean within our own context? If we're sitting in this church this morning and none of us are poor, Luke's gospel is not going to say too much for us. Blessed are the poor. Well, I'm not poor, so I guess I'm out of luck. So, but blessed are the poor in spirit, then there's a possibility that we could be poor in spirit if we're not actually literally poor, right? So what does it mean to be poor in spirit? Let's think about that for a second. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? Give me both possibilities. Okay, that's one possibility. So kind of, I'm poor in spirit, which means that I'm poor in relationship to the Spirit, right? So I don't have the Spirit. So I'm like spiritually empty. Is that, okay? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Yes, but that's still a kind of interior thing, right? Is there a way to think of being poor in spirit that's not simply interior, but is a way in which we can live something out positively? Because remember, this is blessed are. Yeah, good, excellent. So let's think for a minute. If I say to you, you know, I can't be there with you, but I'll be with you in spirit. What does that mean? It could mean that. I couldn't be bothered. But what could it also mean in a more positive way? Yeah, I'm thinking of the person. I'm in solidarity with you. I'm with you in spirit. I can't actually be there physically. But I'm not forgetting about you. I'm remembering you. And I'm in your corner. And maybe that's what Jesus is getting at. And all of us can be poor in spirit in that way. And that seems to fit with some of his emphasis in the rest of the gospel too, about how important it is to be concerned about the poor. And Matthew has, in Matthew 25, 31 to 46, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. So maybe what he's getting at here in terms of being poor in spirit is not some kind of interior poverty, which kind of spiritualizes the whole thing, but rather a kind of poverty in which we are in relationship with people who are poor. We're in solidarity with them. We are concerned about them. We offer a breakfast for folks who are poor. We even move towards having room in the inn. We advocate for justice on behalf of the poor and with the poor. That's being poor in spirit, even though I'm not actually poor. And that fit pretty well with biblical teaching, because in the Bible, poverty is not a good thing in and of itself. I mean, when God's working with the people of Israel, and one of the important stories that you already have read, I'm sure, is about the Exodus story, right? And you have these people who are in abject poverty. who are slaves. And God sides with them and liberates them and brings them into this promised land. And it's flowing with, which doesn't sound all that good perhaps, but milk and honey. So when God's active, there's not poverty. When God's active, there's enough for everybody. And in fact, you read, I think, for this week, a particular story about Jesus sounding very much like the Israelites in the desert when they didn't have enough food. Was that part of one of the stories you read? Did Jesus... I just want to make sure, because I was given the biblical text to work with, and you were given sort of the Reader's Digest version, right? So I want to make sure, do you have a story about Jesus feeding 5,000 folks? Yes. And so Jesus is not, when people are hungry, he doesn't say, hey, blessed are the hungry. He says, let's do something about it. So I'm with the hungry in spirit. What do I do if I'm with people who are hungry? If I'm with them in spirit, I'm going to want to feed them. And that's what Jesus does. And that story, by the way, is in all 4 Gospels. So it must be a pretty important story that all 4 writers preserved it. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we actually experience something of the kingdom of heaven. We're in it. We're experiencing the kingdom of heaven when we are poor in spirit. This is one of the things sometimes we miss as Christians when we hear like that they're going to have a breakfast, or there's going to be room in the inn, or something where we're going to be in close proximity to people who are poor and homeless. We think, well, I'll go because it's my Christian duty. And we may not be very excited about it. And then once we get there and we start getting involved with it, what happens? It's actually fun. It's joyous. And our lives are transformed perhaps more than the lives of the folks that we're serving even. We experience something of the joy of the kingdom. Something that says, blessed are. I mean, that was a good time. And we could go down each one of those and say, how is it that we are going to live good lives, blessed lives, if we practice these Beatitudes? Because that's what Jesus is getting at. Blessing is a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing. So if we're being blessed, this should be a good thing. And it seems counterintuitive. Blessed are the poor in spirit. How could it possibly be good to be poor in spirit? Well, if we're with the poor, if we're working with people who are poor, it's actually a joyous thing. So maybe do you want to do one more? Might as well. We have a few minutes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So now I'm going to ask you a Bible question again, because I really like to quiz people, as you may have noticed. How many times, and we want to get specifics, so I should say, give me some stories about when Jesus mourned in the Gospels, where Jesus cries or weeps or expresses mourning. The death of Lazarus, right? What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. So we have the death of Lazarus, who is his friend. And that's a pretty easy one for all of us to identify with, because how many people in here have lost a loved one or a friend or a relative to death? Let me just get a show of hands. All right, so that's a pretty common experience for us as human beings. And when somebody that we love dies, what do? We mourn. And let's try to unpack that mourning a little bit. What are we mourning about? Yeah, the loss of their presence. So definitely, and Jesus is mourning that about Lazarus. What else are we mourning? Of opportunity of what? To make amends, right? So there might have been something incomplete about that relationship that we wish we could have attended to. What else are we mourning? Life is not going to be the same. So we mourn that. Life has changed. I think like when my dad died a couple of years ago, I felt like the earth had sort of, the world had sort of shifted in a way that I didn't like. Like life was no longer going to be the same. What else are we mourning? Sometimes we have to put a mirror up in front of us. Yes. So part of the mourning is certainly about the loss of the other person. And part of the mourning is also a kind of, to use a fancy word, existential crisis, that we face our own mortality. And Jesus, I think we could say he's doing both of those things. Certainly he's mourning the loss of his friend Lazarus. But Jesus is also looking towards what he knows. He's on a path towards confrontation with the powers that be. And he knows, he's got to know, he's not stupid, that if he continues on that path, what's going to happen to him? He's going to die. He's going to be killed. And so Jesus has to face, like we all do, in response to death, we have to face a really important question, which I think you were kind of getting at, which is, how do we keep living in the face of death? Death is pretty frightening stuff. So how do we keep living? And sometimes when folks lose a loved one, they retreat. And they're so diminished by the death that they never come out of that shell ever again. And part of that is, I think, a kind of defensive mechanism to try to keep death at bay. It'd be as if Jesus responded to the death of Lazarus by saying, all right, I'm done with this Messiah thing. I'm just going back to Nazareth and become a carpenter. And that's one option. We can kind of respond to that threat of death with trying to stay away from death. Or we can do what Jesus did, which is, how did he respond to the death of Lazarus? He wept, but then what did he do? He raised him from the dead, which is a statement of incredible faith in the power of life. Because guess what happened to Lazarus later? He died. Because Lazarus wasn't resurrected. Only Jesus has experienced resurrection. Lazarus was resuscitated, we might say. So Lazarus was going to die again. Sometimes we forget that part of the story because we'd prefer not to think about it. But so in one response, we're thinking, blessed are those who mourn. One way to experience blessing in the context of mourning is to continue to live into the fullness of life. Can we think of another example of when Jesus mourned? Yes, good. So he's definitely mourning there. He's weeping tears of blood, one of the Gospels says. So he's definitely mourning there, and why? Exactly. His humanity is showing forth. And does he continue forward? Yeah, he does. And so in some respects, that mourning is similar to what he's already experienced maybe when he was mourning the death of Lazarus. There's one more example of Jesus mourning. This one's a little more obscure. We don't think about it so much, and it's more political. He probably did, though there's no reference to it in the gospel. There's one other, and I'm trying to give you some hints. See, if you were all like just straight up Roman Catholics like me, I wouldn't ask you these questions because you're not supposed to know your Bible. But, Episcopalians are kind of Protestant, and they kind of still take the Bible seriously, so that's why I'm asking you the question. And don't feel bad if you're not getting it, because most people don't. Jesus is with his disciples in Jerusalem, and they kind of step outside of the city, and they're looking back at the city, and Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. And he says, is that sounding familiar now? Do you remember what he says? And see, I'm Catholic, so I can't give you the exact chapter and verse here. But he's saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Does that sound familiar? What have they been doing? They've been killing the prophets, right? And they've been living in a way that's contrary to the prophets. And what happens if we live contrary to the way of the prophets? It doesn't take a genius, it doesn't even take a Messiah to point this out. What happens if we live contrary to the way in which God calls us to live? And what happens then? Yeah, when we break our relationship with God, we break our relationship with each other and with God's creation. And then what happens? All hell breaks loose. We die, right? It's a way of death. So Jesus is saying, blessed are those who mourn, who can look at a city, like we could look at the city of Memphis. He was looking at Jerusalem, but you could look at any city and say, what direction are we going? Now, on the one hand, I bet you the leaders of Jerusalem, the ruling elite of Jerusalem, was saying something like this: come to Jerusalem, it's a great place to raise a family. You're going to love Jerusalem. Everything here is going great. We've got like these new stadiums that we're putting up. We've got these new bathhouses. We've got all sorts of family entertainment. We're even thinking about bringing in some new professional sports. It's going to be great. And Jesus is looking at that reality, and he's probably quoting from a rap group from the 1980s called Public Enemy, and he's saying, don't believe the hype. That's to mourn, right? To not believe the hype. To look beyond the hype, because don't forget the first beatitude, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, right? The people who are in relationship with the poor are the folks who are learning from the poor about what's actually going on in the city. And then so once you start to learn what's actually going on in the city, it's pretty easy to mourn. And not to mourn in the sense of like, there's nothing we can do about it. But to mourn in the sense of Jesus in relationship to Lazarus and his own death, there is something that we can do about it. We can live in a different way. See, that's good news. But we can't get to the good news unless we first don't believe the hype. Because if we keep believing the hype, we're going to go along the path of destruction that Jerusalem went along, and so do lots of other cities. So, I've been focusing, as you might realize, on the Sermon on the Mount, but I would like, at this point, we've got about 10 minutes, to hear from the reading that you did what questions or concerns you have from the element of the story that you read for this week. Because I've been giving you, like, this is what I think is interesting. But I want to hear from you what you think is interesting. Or anything that I've said already that you may have questions about or comments. How many folks actually did the reading this week? At least one we know. If you didn't do the reading this week, that's not surprising. I often have that issue in my classroom. But I would encourage you to do the reading for this week, because in it, so this coming week, do the reading for this past week, and then do the reading for next Sunday, because I'm going to be here again, and I'm going to ask these same uncomfortable kinds of questions. Jesus is trying to give us a way of life. And that's sometimes what we miss in the Gospels when we read them separately, and that's why it's nice to read them like this story, because they might grab us a little bit more in a fresh context. But Jesus is really concerned that we have a way of life that is fulfilling. You might even go home and read in John chapter 10, verse 10. See, I can quote the Bible once in a while. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Which is who doesn't want a full life? A rich life, a life of purpose and meaning. A life that is wild and precious, quoting from the poem. So Jesus is giving us this wild and crazy kind of life, but it can only happen if we not just believe in Jesus, but we actually believe what he's saying. And that's the hardest. It's so hard because we've been trained to think that Jesus is an unrealistic, idealistic dreamer. It's sort of like Dr. King saying, I have a dream, and we like to put up the Dr. King, I have a dream part, because if it's just a dream, then we can all identify with it, and it lets us all off the hook. Yeah, Dr. King, that's a beautiful dream. We'll get to it someday. But, meanwhile, we've got to live the nitty-gritty real world. And that's kind of like Jesus. We listen to the sermon, read the Sermon on the Mount, we think, well, that sounds great, but, we're sinners. We can't do that stuff. We got to live in the real world. There's even a whole branch of Christian ethics called Christian realism, as if Christianity was unrealistic. So we had to make it realistic. That's a guy by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr who wrote that. He's one of the big people of Christian realism. And that's such an insult to Jesus. It says, Jesus, I'm sorry, but you're not realistic. So I sure believe in you, but I don't actually believe you. And that's why we have to dig deeper into the story and say, how does this even make any sense? So each of those Beatitudes is actually a way to live here and now. We can do every single one of those. Just like we can turn the other cheek in a way that does not mean giving in to evil, but encourages us to find creative, powerful, non-evil ways of resisting evil. And Jesus, if we look at his stories, did he do any healings in the reading? And I can only ask you because nobody else did the reading. Okay, I'm going to come back to the parables real quick. So he heals a couple of blind folks. He heals a couple of other folks too, at least in the version that I was given. There's this woman. So she was in there. That's okay. What was her problem? See, it's such a great story that you can remember it. You just read it once, it's like it sticks with you, right? So, does that sound familiar to anybody? You go to a bunch of doctors, you spend a lot of money, and you still aren't healed. Any physicians in here? So I don't want to insult the physicians. But that happens, even now. And this woman, what kind of disease does she have again? She's bleeding. Well, that sounds kind of nasty. In fact, it's so nasty she would be unclean, according to Jewish law, right? So, she's desperate. And what does she do to Jesus again? And how does he respond to becoming unclean? And did it? Apparently it didn't. So Jesus is standing for, we've got this woman who's being excluded, like the blind guys, because they're panhandlers. And you know, Jerusalem, they had anti-panhandling laws just like Memphis does. So, I mean, all you got to do is go to Overton Square and the signs are up. If you see somebody panhandling, call security, right? Jerusalem had those signs too, I'm pretty sure of it. So they're marginalized by the kind of illness that they have, or the kind of defect that they are seen to have. And what does Jesus do to the folks who are being excluded? He includes them, which is again a way of life. And we can see the same thing with the feeding of the 5,000, because the disciples are like us. Hey, Jesus, we don't have enough. So we've got to hoard this. We can't share it. And Jesus says, no, we're going to give God thanks for what we have, and we're going to share. And once we start sharing, what happens? There's more than enough. When we hoard, there's never enough for anybody. But when we share, lo and behold, the miracle is there's more than enough. And we've already talked about the violence versus peacemaking part with the turn the other cheek. So Jesus in all these stories is giving us a new way of life. Now let's turn just briefly to those parables. Let's pick one. Pick your favorite parable from the reading this week. And again, this young lady over here is the only one who can answer, because nobody else did their homework and they're all going to hell. Any one of those parables stand out to you? I bet you have a clean house, don't you? But you want one. You want to be like that widow. Yeah, every so often. Once a month or so. Mine's like once a year. Do spring cleaning, and then it's got to wait till the next spring. So what is the point of that parable? And what is the valuable thing that Jesus is saying we should be searching for? Yes, the kingdom of God. So we should be as desperate for that coin as this widow was for that coin as we search. So Jesus talks, if we go back to the Beatitudes, one of the last Beatitudes are, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Think about how many people are hungry right now. You've been at church for a couple of hours. You're thinking, hey, it's getting about time to go here. This guy needs to shut up so I can go eat lunch. Anybody hungry? Right? Anybody thirsty? So imagine if as the most hungry you've ever been and the most thirsty you've ever been, if the depth of desire for food and for drink, if you could translate that into your desire for justice. That would be a powerful form of desire, wouldn't it? And Jesus is saying again, when we have that kind of desire, when we're like the widow, when we're searching for the kingdom of God with that kind of intensity, here's the amazing thing. The search is its own reward to some extent, largely. So we don't have to wait like for the sweet by and by, though I'm looking forward to the sweet by and by. I think that sounds pretty good. There's an Irish saint who said that there's a lake of beer in heaven. It sounds good to me. I'm down with that. Because in heaven there's beer apparently, despite the polka song that in heaven there is no beer. This Irish saint says there is. And so I'm going with her. And the good thing in heaven, there are no hangovers either. Right? So we can look forward, but here's what Jesus is trying to get us to see, I think, is that the search is its own reward. That the way of life that he's inviting us into is not just a future promise, it's a present reality. And that's why we want to read these stories, because we want to get into the story. That's the challenge of the Christian life, so that our personal story can become part of this bigger story. This story that gives us purpose and joy and meaning. And so next week, because I'm going to stop here now, next week you're going to come enthused about having taken the time to read the story, because it's going to give you this insight into a way of life that is so amazing that you won't even be able to sit in those pews you'll have to get up and move around a little bit like the Holy Spirit's agitating you. I know that's not very Episcopalian, but it can happen. So I'm going to stop with that, and thank you for your participation, because people did participate, and I appreciate that. And I'll see you next Sunday. Thanks for sitting in.